Alright guys, we've reached the conclusion now of the Civil War. Hope you guys are doing really well. Stay strong, guys. I know we're getting close to the end of the year and you might want to pump the brakes and just be like, yep, I'll do better in high school or something of that nature. No, finish strong, guys. Finish strong. You guys got this, and I'm proud of you guys. Without further ado, let's get going. Grant versus Lee. With Grant being in charge of a huge army and Robert E. Lee being weak after Gettysburg, Grant's idea was to slowly apply the pressure. Don't make any mistakes, just slowly apply pressure and make sure that Lee slowly bleeds out with his army. Now, tactically speaking, Grant's going to lose more men to Robert E. Lee during this whole time period. Grant will lose about 55,000 soldiers to Lee's 35,000, so you might think, oh man, Lee might be winning. However, the North has plenty of soldiers and munitions and rifles and everything to spare. Lee was running out of them. So even though you might see the numbers of Grant losing soldiers, more soldiers, doesn't matter because eventually Lee's going to run out. But why is he running out compared to Grant? Because another general for the North, a guy by the name of General Sherman, is going to destroy any chance the South has to recover in this. This guy believed in something known as total war, which means to destroy everything. Destroy the farm country, destroy the buildings, destroy infrastructure, destroy railroads, destroy it all. Basically the thing that defeated Napoleon, like what the Russians did in their own country. Before we talk about Sherman, though, it's election time. Is it that time already? Yeah, even during civil wars, world wars, or even during this COVID-19 pandemic, people still gotta vote, and the office must be passed down or retained, depending on how those people vote. And the 4 years for Lincoln is now up. Lincoln is going to face an election, and he's going to face a former general of his that he fired for the presidency. Talk about irony. General McClellan was like, I've come back for revenge. And McClellan had a compelling, sales pitch. You let me in as president, I promise to make peace with the South, and you stop seeing our soldiers dying. And if you were in the Civil War during that time period and you saw how much the North was losing, maybe you'd like that. But Lincoln's going to win this election because of a guy named General Sherman. General Sherman, long story short, is going to capture Atlanta, Georgia. It looked like Lincoln was genuinely going to lose the re-election because the people in the North got tired of losing to Robert E. Lee and the South. But when Sherman literally captured Atlanta and set the city on fire, people in the North are like, oh man, we got this. If they took down Atlanta, then all they got to do is just converge onto Richmond now. They voted Lincoln to finish the job, in other words. And once Lincoln wins that election, Sherman goes into his next phase of the operation, the March to the Sea. Long story short, Sherman is going to cripple the war effort for the South. He orders that the city of Atlanta, Georgia to be burned to the ground so the South can't use it anymore. And then he's going to march east towards the Atlantic Ocean and burn everything they see along the way. Now, isn't that a little bit of overkill? Extremely. If you ever drive through those parts of the South, you still see stuff that's been burnt down by by General Sherman. But Sherman believed in this total war thing. If you destroy it all, the South can't use it. And this is going to break Confederate spirits. And then it'll lead to eventually the capture of Richmond. On April 2nd, Grant's troops finally break through Confederate lines and storm the capital of the Confederacy. By evening, the capital was in the hands of the Union. Robert E. Lee is going to be forced to retreat to a place called Appomattox Courthouse, and peace will be shortly afterwards. Lee knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to surrender. He was hoping he'd be resupplied by the South, but when he heard that all of it was on fire because of General Sherman, there was no chance of that happening. Not enough soldiers, not enough weapons. He held out as long as he could, till eventually he had to surrender. And he signs his surrender orders at Appomattox Courthouse to General Grant. Now, Grant was very nice compared to like his friend Sherman. He simply told the Confederates, if you leave your guns here, leave in peace, all is good. Now, why do this? Don't you want the South to deal with like some punishment for this whole war? Think about it. With the war over, we're all Americans again. The people you were just fighting are now your allies once again. In the words of Grant, the war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. So there's no point in punishing them harshly. The Civil War did have a terrible toll, though. More people died in the Civil War than World War II, World War I, and Vietnam combined, as in U.S. soldiers. It's still the bloodiest conflict we've ever dealt with. 260,000 Confederate soldiers will die. We're not talking civilians, we're talking about soldiers. 360,000 Union soldiers will die. However, the war did two things. First, it reunited a nation. A house that once was divided amongst itself, now can stand because we're united. And second, slavery had ended once and for all. All in all, the Civil War lasts between April 12, 1861 at Fort Sumter to April 9, 1865 at Appomattox. And that leads to a period of time in U.S. history known as Reconstruction. How do we rebuild the South now that they're part of our country again, because they will be decimated? So the slavery is over now, right? As the Civil War ends, their slavery issue done, but there are still enormous problems our nation is going to face. The South is in ruins. How are you going to rebuild it? What would happen to the people freed from slavery? Do you give them citizenship? Do you give them like starter money? What's the situation here? So Lincoln had a plan. He made something known as the 10% plan. Basically, to get things rolling quickly, all we need is 10% of you guys to be on board and swear your loyalty, and I'll let you rejoin the Union. Of course, in that oath of loyalty, their contingency was you give up slavery forever. The quicker they did, the faster they could rejoin Congress and get help for the South. And that's going to lead to the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that ensured all people born in the U.S. are citizens, including former slaves, and the 15th Amendment that gave African Americans the right to vote. And some great things also happened, like the Freedmen's Bureau, which was something established in March 1865, which basically set it up where freedmen, who were enslaved people, this bureau would help them adapt to a society where they're no longer slaves, where they pay taxes, where they would get an education, where they could vote, they could own property, all that stuff. So Reconstruction started off really well at the beginning until April 14th, 1865. President Lincoln is going to have no chance to put his entire plans into action when it comes to Reconstruction. On this day, a Confederate sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth slipped behind Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater and assassinated the President of the United States. I didn't get a chance to show you guys pretty much any of my DC pictures from this year from the coronavirus, but I did want to show you that I did actually go to Ford's Theater in DC, and you do actually see the booth where Abraham Lincoln died. And basically, John Wilkes Booth went, shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, jumped off from there, jumped to the stage, and then ran away with a broken leg. And then Lincoln was escorted across the street to a house where he died in this bed. With the nation shocked, Andrew Johnson will assume the office of President of the United States, becoming our 17th president. John Wilkes Booth will be shot dead 2 weeks later after Lincoln's death. And with the death of Lincoln, Lincoln's death really changes the progress of Reconstruction, largely due to a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans, who had no respect for Andrew Johnson. Now, on paper, Andrew Johnson had very similar ideas of Abraham Lincoln when it came to Reconstruction, but he had two things going against him. One, Andrew Johnson was a Southern sympathizer. He used to be a Democrat. Lincoln had him as his vice president because he thought it might be a great idea to heal the South, knowing that their people, their voices are still being heard even in the White House. And also because he's not Abraham Lincoln. The Radical Republicans wanted blood after the Civil War. It's like somebody's got to pay for it. And Andrew Johnson was a guy who wanted to do a soft approach to Reconstruction. Now, admittedly, so did Abraham Lincoln. But that was Abraham Lincoln. The Radical Republicans respected Abraham Lincoln for what he did. They had no respect for Andrew Johnson, to the point that they impeached Andrew Johnson, pretty much because they didn't like him and he wasn't Abraham Lincoln. They looked for any excuse to try to get rid of him. And that excuse happened to be he fired someone in his cabinet without congressional approval. Now, is that something worthy trying to get rid of a president? In my opinion, no. That's a really petty rule to break to try to ruin someone's life. But the radical Republicans in Congress who wanted blood after the Civil War, they didn't care. They were looking for any excuse to get rid of him. And it went to a trial in the Senate, and it was one vote away from removing him. And the senator who held his vote basically said, y'all are nuts. Like, you're trying to ruin this guy's life for this? Come on. So Andrew Johnson will be impeached. He's the first president ever to be impeached, but he will not be removed. And there was a lot of bad things because of this whole thing with the Republicans and this fight with Andrew Johnson. The South is going to get uglier and uglier. You're going to see stuff like sharecropping become a thing where it's basically the South using a system to try to keep African Americans always down to the point that they basically would be impoverished. You had stuff like a poll tax, so like African Americans who were poorer at the time couldn't vote compared to their white counterparts, meaning they can't vote people in office to change legislation. You had stuff like Plessy v. Ferguson, which literally legalized segregation not just in the South, but also in the North. And at the end of Reconstruction, they got rid of the slavery issue and they made Africans Americans votes and all that different stuff. But because Abraham Lincoln dies from assassination, he can't carry out the full package of civil rights and stuff like that. That gets bogged down by this situation with Andrew Johnson being impeached and radical Republicans wanting the emphasis on radical. Radical means extreme. Extreme Republicans trying to make the South pay, and the South will ultimately tighten its grip on its racism. Ultimately, Reconstruction isn't going to accomplish the grander scheme of Lincoln's ideas about full political rights for African Americans, the thing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood for. Sure, slavery is going to be abolished, but there's a reason Martin Luther King Jr. is still going to have a dream basically 100 years after the fact, because the racism aspect doesn't get addressed, which probably would have been addressed if Abraham Lincoln didn't get assassinated. And that leads through a whole history of the United States where African Americans still had one more battle to fight, the fight for civil rights. And that'll end Reconstruction, as in the South will be rebuilt, but it won't fix an inherent issue, which was the racism in it. But other than that, guys, that concludes it when it comes to the Civil War. Make sure you guys do your worksheet and make sure you're on the lookout for an assessment next week where you're going to have a couple options to do this. But one of them is a little bit more interesting where you're making fake tweets of these people in the Civil War as if you were tweeting on their behalf. So I hope you like that idea. I know a lot of you guys did in the Zoom. Other than that, take care, guys. I'll see you later.